couple of years ago when my son was in first grade, he had a lesson he learned in school and brought home some homework on, which was teaching him about opinions versus facts. Right? They were trying to teach them in first grade to understand the distinction between those two and just get comfortable with, what's an opinion and what's a fact. And they would have to look around the house and write a few statements that were opinions versus facts. They might have to look around and say, well, my house is white, right? That's a fact. Versus my house is really big. Well, that's an opinion, right? It's relative. What you think it's big, somebody else might think it's small. And they would kind of go around and do that. So naturally, the way I think and the way my mind works, I thought that was a cool exercise. I thought that was an important thing to teach somebody in first grade. And they did it the right way, right? With some basic things like that. But it starts to get them to appreciate the differences between opinions and facts. So we talked a lot about it, and we would kind of play games in the car sometimes where I would say, hey, look out the window and give me 3 facts, 3 opinions. Or we would watch a movie, and I'd say, hey, give me 3 facts about that movie, 3 opinions. And it was cool. And it was a fun little exercise. And what was good about it is, he started to appreciate why at times it can be tricky to distinguish those two, right, in our own minds, which we all still struggle with to even as adults. But he might say something like, that movie was the best movie I've ever seen, or that character is the toughest character or the coolest character I've ever seen. And as you say it, any of us would hear that and be like, oh, that's obviously an opinion. But as a first grader, a second grader, you start to recognize that challenge of like, but that feels so real. Like that was the coolest movie I've ever seen. I'm certain of that. Definitely that was the coolest movie. And you start to understand that when you feel really strongly about something and you believe it so strongly, it can start to feel like a fact. And when you play that game, you start to force to distinguish those still and recognize like, oh, even though I really think that's true, that's just my opinion. It doesn't mean it's a universal truth. It doesn't mean it's a fact. So we had a lot of fun with that, and we would use it all the time. And it started to evolve to something where, it became a valuable phrase and tool to kind of keep us kind of grounded and thinking about things the right way and not overreacting, not losing perspective on things. So what do I mean by that? I'll give an example. So let's stick with the TV show, right? Let's say my son loves a certain TV show. He loves the show Troll Hunters on Netflix. He might have a friend who one day, tells him, hey, I hate Troll Hunters. I think it's a stupid show. I think it's the worst show on TV. And then my son will come back and tell me about that, for example, and say, hey, such and such said he hates Troll Hunters and it's a really stupid show. And maybe my son's upset by that, right? He's mad, he's confused, he can't understand how that person could think that. And that phrase of like, well, hey, that's an opinion, not a fact. It's such a good way to kind of reset him to be like, oh, yeah, that's right. There's lots of opinions out there. And it's that reminder that I can use as much as he can all the time of just like, hey, I don't need to defend this. I don't need to fight about this. I don't even need to get angry about it. I certainly don't need to agree with it if I think he's wrong or I see it differently. But the important thing is that I just remember that that's an opinion. That's that person's opinion. It's not a fact. So that little tool, that little mental construct comes in handy so much to the point where I use it myself all the time, where certain things happen and I say, okay, it's just an opinion. It's not a fact. That's fine. So it's become really valuable in that regard too. What's cool though is he's getting older now, right? A few years past that original lesson is you start to, not to get too philosophical, but you start to explore this whole idea of opinion versus fact. And you start to see and appreciate that it's not necessarily a binary thing, right? Opinion or fact. Which one is it? It ends up being a little bit more of like a continuum or a spectrum. Certainly on the one end is a fact, right? And the threshold for that, you start to realize how high that threshold is. What does it mean to actually be a fact, right? It's got to be 100% certain that this thing is true. And anything short of that is an opinion. And as you start to think of it through that lens and the way he learned it in first grade, where unless you're absolutely certain, unless you can prove it, right? If it's just something you think or you believe is true, well, then that's an opinion. You start to realize like, well, hey, in most cases, it's an opinion and not a fact. Even the things we think are facts, right? You start to struggle to actually find something that fits that definition in the truest sense. And it could be anything, right? It could be, I'll make it up, but, let's say he learned, XYZ invention happened in 1722, right? Totally making it up. But somebody invented this in 1722. That's something that commonly and obviously him as a third grader now or any of us would hear and say, okay, well, that's a fact. Good. That's a perfect example of a fact. But when you really start to think about it, you say, well, is it a fact? You say, well, how do I know that's true? Do I know? Was I there? Well, no, I wasn't there. Well, then how do I know? Well, it was in the book. Okay, but who wrote the book? Do I know the person in the book wrote it right? Do I know that maybe they didn't realize that somebody else invented it earlier? Do I know that when they wrote the book, they did all their homework and did it the right way, right? And this isn't for me to try and like destroy the whole construct of facts and the educational system or anything like that, because there are things that we do need to generally believe and kind of, I'm not trying to put a vote in for anarchy here. But I think there's something important in us, all of us, recognizing this distinction between opinion and fact, and how high the threshold should be for a fact. And something like that, when we're told something was invented at a certain point in time, it's okay to hear that and say, okay, that's the best information I have right now. And if I take a test, that's the answer I'll give. And that's kind of my working knowledge of this topic. But at the same time, to appreciate that, well, I actually can't say for certain that that's a fact. It's possible somebody invented that sooner, right? And a lot of people will take that and think that's like a political statement or some sort of social statement. And I think that's the problem. It's trying to get to the truth of the matter. If you don't know for absolutely certain, well, then don't call it a fact. Just call it your opinion or the best information you have at this moment. And this concept, this construct of opinion versus fact, has been very useful for us in our household, at least, to kind of keep that in mind, to kind of keep that perspective on things and keep us thinking of things in a way in which we never get too tied to it. You never get too wed to this idea that this is definitely true. And if somebody says something counter to it, I must defend it. I must protect it. Listen, it's an opinion. There's lots of opinions out there. Lots of people see it different ways. That's their opinion. It's not a fact.